Hey guys, Random Potato here, bringing you a guide to all the cultist combats in the game. First, let's discuss regular cultist battles. You find these fights at Cultist Encounter nodes and the first stage of the Guardian. There are 4 different enemies in this pool. First is the Evangelist. The Evangelist is the primary damage dealer of this group, with one front rank AoE bleed and blind attack, and a single target bleed and stress nuke. Their buff, Nocturne Commune, gives them a dodge and crit token. Their skills are position-based, and their powerful attacks can only be used in ranks 1 and 2. So if you can push them back, you can force them to use Rush Judgment, which is a weak attack with no additional effects except moving them forward. Their base HP is 23, and they spawn with a dodge token, with a small 5% deathblow resist, making them the tankiest of this group. Next we have the Herald, the single-minded stress nuker. By far their most common move is Clarion Call, a 2 to 3 stress attack which can be used from any position to any position. Their most common move is their back rank to back rank AoE nuke, First Trumpet, which applies bleed and burn along with damage. Harmonious End is a rare stress nuke that can be used only from rank 4. They also have a unique ability called Inversion, which can transform negative tokens on their allies to positive tokens. Their base HP is 18 with no death store. The Cherub is a back rank utility stress caster. Enfeebling Miasma can hit the front rank with stress and weak. Sightless Miasma can hit back row with stress and blind. Face Your Confession is horror application along with a dodge plus buff. If you manage to move them to the front, the Cherub can only use Brisk Bedevilment, which is a very weak front rank attack that moves them back. The Cherubs have a pathetic 14 base HP and no death store, but spawn with dodge plus, making them an easy kill if you can hit them. Finally, we have the Altar, the pure buff bot enemy. He starts every combat with a free action altar buff, which changes based on what chapter you are playing. Altar of Denial, Chapter 1, gives all enemies a 33% chance of stealth at round start. Altar of Resentment, Chapter 2, gives all enemies a combat-long buff that gives them a 25% chance of a combat token upon being hit. He has a party-wide 3 regen ability called Flesh Weaving, and he has a single target buff, Bone Weaving, that gives a strength and block token. If the altar is the last enemy remaining, it will use Asiok End, a big damage and stress nuke on 2 heroes. All these moves can be used in any position, making moving it mostly pointless. Altar's base HP is 20 with no deathblow resist. This combat can never spawn more than 2 of the same unit and only 1 of the altar, and will generally place the enemies in their most effective positions: Evangelist in front, Cherub and Altar in back. So the way I approach these fights is Evangelist and Herald are the most immediate deadly threats. If you are high stress, Herald can push you into meltdown mode, making you an easy target for the other enemies. If you're low health, the high damage and bleed of the Evangelist can kill you outright. The Herald is generally the softest target, with no natural dodge or block, and relatively lower health, so they're generally my first target. If an altar is spawned, I make them my second target, since the enemy party loses the altar buff once the altar is killed. You almost never will want to leave the altar for last, to avoid unnecessary stress with Asiok End. Cherubs and Evangelists are both manipulated by positioning, so pulls, pushes, and corpse clears will help block their most powerful skills. AoE combat items like caltrops can be handy in stripping dodge, same with AoE skills. Bellow Upgraded is particularly useful here, erasing the crit tokens from Evangelist and altar buffs alike. Cherub should always be the last enemy to kill, as they are the least dangerous. The second type of cultist battles are ones that include the size 2 enemies, the Deacon and Cardinal. A Deacon fight headlines the first Guardian node, a Cardinal battle is at the second Guardian, and you will battle the Deacon and Cardinal duo as the last mountain battle before the boss. If you have to fight a Zero Light ambush, you will face either a Deacon or Cardinal there too. Each of these fights, except the Deacon-Cardinal duo obviously, will contain 2 from the first pool of cultist enemies. In these fights, the main mechanic is that each skill the minion enemies use will grant them 1 worship token. When an enemy has 2 worship tokens, it will use a free action on its next turn to heal the Deacon or Cardinal, remove dots, and apply 1 worship token to them. If the Deacon or Cardinal acquire 2 worship tokens, they will unlock a powerful nuke sure to devastate your team. So the fights revolve around eliminating either the minions before they can worship, or nuking the mini-boss outright. First up is the Deacon, a 41 HP size 2 monster with 33% death blow resist. His main gimmick is Flesh Warp, where at the start of his turn he will randomly buff himself to take minus 50% melee or range damage, and alternate between the two on all subsequent turns. He has a single target front row nuke, only usable in front 2 ranks, where he usually is, called Sundering Steel, which applies high damage and 3 stress. If you manage to put him in the back row, he uses Flesh from Bone, another front row single target nuke that does bleed. Weight of Worlds is his AoE damage, stress, immobilize move. His Exaltation, the move he unlocks at 2 worship, is a large damage, stress, bleed nuke that hits rank 1 only. Because of his targeting limitations, the Deacon is fairly predictable and his damage can easily be neutralized with front row tanks. Although if you let the fight drag on, he'll still decimate you with dots and stress. Having a variety of melee and range damage helps counter his Flesh Warp mechanic. As long as you have some front load damage, I like rushing down this enemy before the turn 3 worships start coming in. With Flesh Warp, you can comfortably set up turns ahead of time to do maximum damage. Be careful with movement-based comps because Weight of Worlds can leave you immobile, making it harder to rely on things like Jester Finale or manipulating Highwaymen to rank 1 for point blank on the correct turn. His Exaltation is the least dangerous of all the mini-boss cultists, so eating one isn't too bad, assuming you have a tank that lives in rank 1. Still, all his front rank moves do high stress, so rarely is it correct to kill the minions first, unless you just don't have the front load or variety of damage necessary to kill the Deacon in 2 turns. The Cardinal is the Deacon's slightly more tanky partner, with 46 base HP. An AoE specialist, from the back he can AoE stress Vol nuke, and can stress shuffle from any position. He has a single target nuke which applies all 3 dots, making battlefield medicine or medicinal herbs very helpful in this fight. His raw damage is not that impressive, and is more set up for his most effective minion, Evangelist. But his AoE stress and shuffle should make him your first target generally. Thankfully, without Flesh Warp, he is much more predictable than the Deacon, but be sure to bring some back row damage since he's more prone to live there than the Deacon. Moving him is fairly pointless, so focusing on raw damage is the correct play. His dot resist is pedestrian, so make sure to bring some to get some extra death's door checks on him to stop him before his Exaltation. As said before, the top priority in these fights is to prevent worship and Exaltation, so you must either kill the mini-boss or the minions before their turn on round 3. Thankfully, as of the Cultist update, worship is no longer an auto action at round start, but a free action at each minion's turn beginning. This means you can block their worship with stun, dot kills, or moving ahead of them and killing on round 3. In most situations, I have enough damage to nuke the boss first and deal with the minions later. Evangelist and Cherub spawning with dodge makes them a riskier target. If facing a Herald, though, I will often nuke them first since they have no inherent dodge, block, and relatively low health, and their stress is equivalent to Deacon's nuke. I will often target the altar first too, in order to eliminate the altar buff and block them from continuously buffing the mini-boss, especially with block. Mixing and matching between killing minions and boss is also a strategy, since a single worship on the Deacon Cardinal does nothing, giving you an extra turn or 2 to kill them. When fighting the Deacon or Cardinal in the mountain, I will generally kill the Deacon first, mostly because my best damage is often front rank, he has lower health, and Cardinal is less dangerous alone in my opinion. Moving the Deacon is a good option in this fight, but is not necessarily reliable with their strong move resist, more of just an additional option to attempt. The final cultist boss, the Exemplar, is found at the final Guardian, as the first fight of the mountain, and also appears if you let your loathing hit max level. A behemoth with 101 base HP, but will generally be ordained at 141 HP, and a terrifying 75 death blow resist, this size 3 enemy also boasts solid resistances to dots, stuns, and debuffs. He gets 2 actions per round, and will always spawn front rank with 1 minion in back. His primary mechanic is self-worship, which he acquires in 2 different ways. If one of your characters is comboed, which the Exemplar can apply himself, he can nuke your hero and gain a worship. He can also self-sacrifice a minion to gain 1 worship for himself. Now let's go through the Exemplar skills more in depth. Prelude does solid damage, applies a massive 6x3 blight, pulls, and adds a combo. The follow-up move, The End, applies a large damage nuke, eats the combo, and gives Exemplar a worship token. Rapturous Beauty hits 2 targets with small damage, horror, and vuln application. Pillar of Sacrifice becomes usable when the minion has 2 worship tokens. The Exemplar uses its turn to kill the minion, applies self-regen, 2 riposts, and a worship token. And finally, when the Exemplar gains 2 worship tokens, they unlock their Exaltation, which is a 2-hero Deacon nuke. The main trick to this fight is to find a way to play around combo and nuke the boss before they can do Exaltation, and or stack your team with block and taunts to mitigate the heavy damage. Blight Resist is quite useful here to keep dots from pinging your death's blow if you do get nuked, as well as Burn Resist if you're facing an ordained Exemplar in Act 2. The most dangerous part of this fight for me is usually the beginning. The Exemplar is moderately fast, so he has a chance to get back-to-back Prelude the End on you before you're set up with your taunts. As said before, avoiding the end is critical, as you don't want to allow the Exemplar to exalt at all, especially without having to sacrifice his minion. You can block the end in all the normal ways, with defend or taunts. The end also cannot hit rank 4, so you can hide in the back as well if you do get comboed. Holy Water is also quite useful here. As far as the minion goes, I almost never bother killing it. The altar is by far the most annoying, since it will give regen, strength, block, and the altar bonus to the Exemplar. But the Exemplar will use one of its turns to kill the minion itself eventually, only gaining regen and riposte. The regen is nowhere near as impactful as a percentage heal would be, and while the riposte is quite dangerous, it can be mitigated by proccing it only with high HP or character with block and dodge. Bellow is a good option here as well, especially for an Act 2 altar. Just sitting back and taking whatever the minion does for the few turns it's active is made up for by getting those extra actions of damage and dots on the Exemplar instead of wasting them on the minion. As far as combat items, the usual heals do well here, and smoke bombs can be strategically used to neutralize the Exemplar on his worst turns. Holy Water is a great option as well. This is also pretty good anti-venom use case, especially if you're running without a Plague Doctor. Considering skills, the Exemplar's size, with no inherent block or dodge, opens up your whole direct damage arsenal, which is the preferred killing method. The Exemplar has fairly strong resist, so without trinkets and paths to boost dot damage, it's not as strong, even though his 2 actions around make dots stronger than against a normal cultist. With the looming Exaltation, stalling doesn't really work in this fight, so heals should be reserved for desperate situations to avoid death checks, and stress heals should generally be avoided altogether. The first Exemplar is at the Guardian before the inn, allowing you to fix your stress levels there. The mountain is scarier, and is another major reason to specifically hunt oases in early regions to hoard spring water for recovery after this fight. Overall, this is a fairly terrifying battle, and with poor planning and or bad RNG, can go wrong in a hurry. But in general, if your team is properly scaled, as it should be in the endgame, you should have no problem dispatching this foe in 3 to 5 turns and avoiding the worst this boss has to offer. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more weekly Darkest Dungeon 2 content, and let me know in the comments your strategies for tackling the cultist fights.